Taiwan has done a fabulous job with the pandemic of navigating and managing it. It's really a wonderful blending of expertise and individual thinking with a community objective, right? Better, maybe other countries could have learned from what Taiwan did, right? I mean, we'd be in a better place if others had done that, if other countries had followed the Taiwanese lead. The book, Think for Yourself, was really a book that sort of helps people to navigate uncertainty. That's really the mission of the book, is to give people a framework for thinking about all of the cross currents that are coming in their lives. And the arc of the book really is a story that begins with the current zeitgeist, the difficulties many of us are feeling with all of the information and data that is really, we're drowning in it. And so when we drown in information and have sort of data overload, one of the things we do is we run to the experts and technologies to try to get their help to make the best decision. We think there is an optimal, perfect decision for every choice we are asked to make. Why shouldn't there be? There's so many choices, so much data, we should be able to optimize. The result is we have stopped thinking. We've outsourced our thinking to these experts and these technologies. And so the book really starts with that as the current problem many of us are facing as individuals, as managers, and as leaders. And it suggests there is a way forward. There's some problems, of course, with outsourcing our thinking, but really the bottom line message that I'm trying to convey in this book is best summarized by actually one of the chapter titles, which is Keep Experts on Tap, Not on Top. And what do I mean by that? It means that we should not dismiss experts, right? It's equally problematic to dismiss experts as it is to blindly defer to experts. And so what I'm suggesting is a middle ground where we tap into the value of expert thinking, the value of technological optimization, and yet we put it into our context and that we own the decision. That's what I mean when I say think for yourself. And the book is filled with stories to show how one can do that. The origin of this book really actually begins further before that Harvard Business Review article. For much of my career and for much of my life, in fact, I have found it quite difficult for people to put me in a box. When they wanted to be an economist, they want me to be an economist. I tend to look at the political context in which the economics happens. When they said, oh, we have to look at the politics, I said, well, let's look at the culture and the sociology of the environment. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense you can't understand, if you don't understand how the people feel, how will you understand the political context? So one of the things that's critical for me in thinking about the world is to adopt multiple perspectives. And so in many ways, what I think there is that being a generalist is very important. Crossing silos. There are many experts that are able to develop dots. I want to suggest it's equally important to connect the dots. And so really my first book was about financial bubbles. And it was about how multiple lenses could be used to connect the dots, to identify a financial bubble before it burst. This is very controversial within the world of economics, but I looked at not only an economic perspective, a political perspective, a sociology perspective, a herd behavior perspective, etc. And what I found was that framework actually proved more useful outside of the world of finance than perhaps even within the world of finance. And so the original testing of the waters of that thesis was this article that I wrote for the Harvard Business Review called All Hail the Generalist. And in fact, another little tidbit that you might find interesting is at one point I had given a speech to a large audience of individuals. I believe it was actually in Europe. And one of the audience members, he was an older gentleman. I think he was in his 90s. He came to me afterwards and said, Dr. Vikram Mansharamani, Dr. Vikram, I would love to keep in touch. Is it possible? I said, certainly, here's my business card, keep in touch. And the following year, he sent me a note And he said, your framework for spotting financial bubbles that you articulated helped me and my wife when we were given a cancer diagnosis. And I said, wait, what? That's very interesting. Why? Please explain. And he said, really, what we decided was it was important to look through multiple lenses, to zoom out and to think for ourselves, not rely blindly on the doctors. They wanted us to have this treatment, which would have diminished the quality of my life. And I decided to think for myself and do those trade-offs. And so that was quite inspirational, actually, to hear that a framework I had originally started applying in the world of finance was applicable to uncertainty, medical decision-making, business and leadership decisions. And so really that's how the book's story evolved. It started with this belief that being a generalist is useful to navigating finance, but I found that it was actually useful in navigating uncertainty. And that's really the origin of the book. So I don't know if you can see this picture of the fox that I keep in my office. There's a famous Greek poet, Archilochus, back in 2,500 years ago, described the difference between a fox and a hedgehog. The hedgehog knows one big thing and the fox knows many little things. And so that's one way of describing a specialist versus a generalist, right? A specialist knows one big thing. They know it very well. They're very narrow and deep. A fox might be broad and maybe not so deep, but knows a lot of different things. And so I think of myself as a fox, meaning I don't know very much about anything, but I know a little bit about a lot of things. And so that's why I keep a picture of a fox over my desk. If you really want to be successful, focus on failure. And what do I mean by that? I mean, in a very simple term, there's this logic of playing a devil's advocate. Before you make a decision, you should always think about what would happen if you did the opposite. Always, we have these boardroom discussions where they're filled with people that tend to agree. And I think it's very important to develop disagreement, that actually one should seek out the alternative perspective. There's wonderful examples in the book about how this proved quite useful. But really, I think it's more than an intellectual exercise of thinking through the alternative. It helps you think about different outcomes, different possibilities. And even if you didn't expect certain outcomes from a particular decision, understanding and thinking about the path could lead to failure might help you avoid those very pitfalls that could lead that way. So one of the strategies that I've suggested in the book could prove useful. I've used it in my corporate consulting work, but frankly, it's useful for individuals in an individual decision-making capacity as well. And that's something known as what they call in the academic literature, prospective hindsight. And what do I mean by prospective hindsight? What I mean, more colloquially, we call this a pre-mortem analysis. So usually you have a post-mortem, right? There's been a failure. Let's understand why. And actually what I want to do and what I want to suggest, and it's building on the work of others, is actually that's not very helpful. I'd rather avoid the failure, right? I mean, so let's do the pre-mortem before we fail. So how does one do that? Imagine yourself in the future 3 to 5 years from now. And you've made a decision, and 3 to 5 years from now, you've had massive failure. The exact opposite of what you wanted to happen has happened. Now tell me why. Let's articulate the reasons why that failure has shown up. What occurred? Did you forget about the environment? Did you forget about your competitors? Did you forget about a technology development that might have happened? Maybe there was a new government that came to power. Maybe there was a pandemic. Maybe there was a disruption. Talk to me about what could have resulted in that potential failure in the future. Now, having thought about that, let's revisit the decision today. Let's revisit the decision having thought about failure. And I think the very act of thinking about how failure can come forth minimizes the likelihood that those particular sources of failure will come to fruition. And so that's really my favorite tidbit, which is to be successful, focus on failure. One analogy that I tend to make a fair amount is as if, to be successful in navigating uncertainty as a leader, sometimes it's good to think of yourself effectively as a conductor, right? And so imagine you have an orchestra and there's a violinist. The violinist knows how to play the violin better than you as the conductor does. So we know that we need the violinist. We also know we need the percussionist, someone playing the drums. We know we have a flutist. We need someone to do everything that's specialized. But there's magic when you bring it all together. And so when you can think of yourself as a leader who brings together the appropriate parts, I think there really is a possibility of achieving a lot more. And that's true in the business context. That's true for sure in personal decision-making, whether it's financial decision-making or medical decision-making, or even, education choices. It is really appropriate to think about the harmony that comes from bringing together different forms of expertise. So that's one tidbit I would want to emphasize. The other thing that I sometimes like to talk about is this sort of deferral. And so let me describe it this way. We have found ourselves almost like a ping pong ball bouncing back and forth, like a pendulum even, swinging back and forth between complete deferral to experts. We must listen to the experts. We must listen to the experts. Do what the experts tell us. We don't know what we're doing. We have to listen to the experts. We've gone from that one extreme, sometimes to the other extreme, where we say, forget about the experts, the eggheads, those people, we've had enough of the experts. In fact, that was a line used in Brexit, right? Sort of, we've had enough of the experts. We've had those pointy head, egghead types, which are referring to the technocrats that sit there and do their calculations. And so we say, we've had too much of the experts. We need no more experts. What we need is more nuance down the middle. We don't want to dismiss experts, but we also want to be careful when we defer to experts. There is this middle ground, and it requires us to think for ourselves. That's really the key message, which is utilize expertise without deferring to expertise. I believe every single perspective is limited, biased, and incomplete. So don't rely on any individual perspective. What we want to do is use multiple perspectives. If this perspective gives me one piece of the story, this perspective gives me another piece of the story, this one gives me a third piece of the story, a fourth piece, a fifth piece, etc. Only by seeing multiple pieces can we possibly understand the whole. And so if we understand and accept that every single perspective is limited, biased, and incomplete, you would turn around and you'd say, well, of course it makes sense to then use multiple perspectives. And so that's really one of the key messages of the book. Writing this book took me longer than I expected. My first book took less than a year to write and put it together and publish it, and it was wonderful. This one took maybe 3 to 4 times that time. And it was partially because there is so much information and it's changing so rapidly. And so ultimately what I found useful was, one has to filter. You have to filter, right? And you have to focus. And I talk about in the book both the upside and downside of focus, right? I mean, focus is a two-edged sword, and we have to remember that. And so what I concluded ultimately was, while I think focus means you're narrowly paying attention to a sliver of what's happening, that's the definition of focus. The other way to think about focus is you are broadly ignoring, right? So when I say, let's focus, everyone says, okay, that's good. We want to focus. Everyone, what don't you like about focus? And if I say, well, let's broadly ignore, you say, no, we don't want to broadly ignore. Why should we ignore everything? Well, they're the same thing. Broadly ignore and narrowly focus is the same thing. And so what I found was actually, and I describe it in the book as mindfully managing your focus, actually focusing on your focus. Understand what you are leaving out when you focus. And so when I did that, it became quite empowering to me to write the book. I said, you know what? I can't cover everything. And this won't be my only book. Maybe I'll have another book. But for now, instead of talking about group optimization, instead of talking about the psychology of could happen after failure and the trauma, this type of dynamic, let's not worry about those things. Let's just focus a little bit on the topic at hand. And so that became the method through which I was able to break my own drowning in information problem. Yeah, I had to take my own advice, right? I mean, I had to focus on focus and take my own advice. I had to think for myself. One of the things I did write about in the book was the class that I've been teaching at Harvard. And the class I've been teaching at Harvard is called Humanity and Its Challenges. And one of the things I have, it's taught within the engineering school. And one of the things I have the students do is I have them read novels. I have them read fiction. And this is quite shocking to an engineering student. They say, wait, what? This story is not real. This is not true. This is pretend. This is fiction. I said, yes. And it'll help you expand your imagination. It'll help you think creatively about the future. It'll help you envision different possible futures. And one of the classes we've been teaching for years was about a pandemic risk. And we use the movie Contagion. I talk about this in the book. In fact, it was written well before the current pandemic. And so one of the things that I would probably emphasize a little more is uncertainty by definition is something we can't know, right? And as such, we need to broaden our lens even wider. We need to take a wide angle lens and read broadly. You should read more fiction. I know it sounds like, oh, this is a fantastic story. It's not real. Well, the movie Contagion actually was pretty accurate in terms of possible outcomes that have transpired. Now, it was a little dramatic. Of course, there's some Hollywood drama. They have to do this to sell the movies. But the basic underlying premise of a disruptive global pandemic actually came to fruition. And so likewise, there are other cases that we should look at and read fiction. Particularly right now, I'm reading a lot of fiction about space and progress in space. And, you can call it science fiction, but I really like the fact that some of the authors I've been reading have called it surprise fiction rather than science fiction. And I think surprise fiction is more interesting because it suggests that actually these things are all possible today. They're all possible today. So Margaret Atwood is an author who writes a lot about surprise fiction. So these developments are possible today. This is not some new technology needed. It's a shocking, jarring way to think about the future. And so that's one angle that I think I would probably emphasize more, which is because of so much uncertainty in the world, because we're unable to predict the future, let's start thinking about multiple futures, not singular, plural, multiple futures, because that's the best way to navigate the uncertainty, is to have a map of possible terrain where we may be going. Since we can't know, let's think about multiples. So that's probably the biggest tidbit, I would say. And it also, I find a lot of the people who tend to read nonfiction books, such as this book, such as my book, such as other nonfiction books, they tend to be the ambitious career climbing professionals. And they tend to prioritize nonfiction, leadership, business strategy, those types of books, current affairs books. They feel they have to keep up. And as such, they don't take as much time as I think would be useful to take a step back and contemplate and imagine, to develop that creative instinct. And I think if they're able to do more of that, they'll be more successful professionally. Taiwan has done a fabulous job with the pandemic of navigating and managing it. And I think that's really partially because of well, having a leader with a public health background doesn't hurt the cause, so to say, but it's really a wonderful blending of expertise and individual thinking with a community objective, right? So I think the idea of managing expertise is as relevant in Taiwan as it is everywhere around the world, which is we are individuals, but we live in groups. And as such, there's this balancing act between, what may be optimal, i.e. following the expert advice for everyone, or what may be appropriate for me as an individual. We know, for instance, with these lockdowns and quarantines, that there are some mental health costs. There are some other costs. And so, if we're able to do it, a lockdown very, rapidly and aggressively, then maybe we would navigate it better. Maybe other countries could have learned from what Taiwan did, right? I mean, we'd be in a better place if others had done that, if other countries had followed the Taiwanese lead. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think, another tidbit which might prove useful for readers in Taiwan is, from an educational perspective, not just Taiwan, but Asia generally, tends to value deep expertise. And I want to suggest that in a world that is increasingly filled with cross currents, it is increasingly important to develop that generalist logic. And that means having an appreciation for areas outside of your own area of expertise. You may be an economist. That doesn't mean you shouldn't understand engineering. You may not be an engineering expert. You may not understand systems design. You may not understand electrical circuitry, etc. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to be aware of it. And so what I think is more and more important every day, everywhere, is that we develop an appreciation for not only the knowledge we know and the limits on that, but also for the knowledge we don't know and where to get it. So being a generalist gives you a map of information flow, if you will, so that I know I'm not expert in politics, but I know this is an issue where I need that expertise. Let me go get it. So you can think of yourself as an artist and you're making a mosaic. And so you have to go find the right tiles to put them down, but you are in charge of the picture. And so I think, Taiwan is no exception. The Asian cultures generally, the devotion, maybe devotion is the right word, to expertise, maybe should be slightly dampened down a little bit. And maybe the appreciation for people who are wider thinkers, broader thinkers, maybe we can elevate those a little bit more. The devotion to expertise and technocratic expertise, knowing how to do something. I have an economist. This person studied economics in college. They studied economics in graduate school. They've been a practicing economist. They've now been in the government doing economic analysis and economic planning, and they've been a full lifelong economist. I'm not saying that's bad, but by no means am I suggesting expertise is bad. We need experts. But we also need the individuals who can contextualize that expertise. And we want those experts to have an appreciation for the domain and the context in which their decisions are taking place and the advice that they're giving, right? You need to understand the big picture. And so there's an obligation both on the leadership's part to understand where all of this expertise comes into play, but there's also an obligation on the part of the expert to understand where they fit in terms of the big picture. And I think developing an appreciation for that is something liberal arts education actually encourages. So, maybe we shouldn't put liberal arts education down as much as has been the case, not only actually in Asia, but also here in, the Western world. We find that liberal arts has been seen as a luxury, if you will, right? We need real skills. How is my, any parent you talk to in the United States, I don't want my child going and getting a philosophy degree. I want my child to get a degree where they can get a job. They need skills. They need either engineering. They need medical training. They need, scientific training. They need to have some marketable skill set. Whereas, someone who studies art history, they may have a different perspective on life. They may, in fact, be the most creative of anyone in the room, and they may come up with the solution for the next big thing. And so, I think of balancing, neither this nor that. A little bit of all, I think, is the best recommendation I can give.